Welcome back to the Shema podcast, my friends. The idea behind today's episode was a result of me contemplating the worldview I had up until the age of 40. I believe it's the worldview of many Jews today. And this is basically the way I looked at things growing up, only surrounded by either non-religious Jews or Christians who were religious, not religious. That was my surrounding. I really didn't see any distinction between them. I mean, we all worked hard, wanted to provide for our families. Really, I think everyone wanted to do business with integrity. Everyone was a good person. We took care of our lawns, brought our recycling out to the curb. I mean, what's the difference? Now, if I had met like the Rabbi Wolbes back in my 20s, or I guess they were in their teens at that point in time, but someone like them, someone that had dedicated themselves to Torah, I would have seen a distinction between groups of people. But at that point in time, I did not. And I did not see any distinction. And when I look back at world history, or what I thought was world history, was that if you look at mankind, we have all evolved together. All mankind was primitive. They were all barbaric. Even though I had a very limited knowledge of the Torah, I knew about the wars that our Tanakh discussed of going into the land of Canaan and killing the inhabitants in that land. I mean, there was really no distinction the way I saw it. But yet mankind has continued to evolve, and it was a collective effort, is the way I saw it. And really the only thing holding back mankind was the fact that they were holding on to these ideas, these traditions, these fables of their unique cultures that cultivated their ideas of religion. And if mankind could just unshackle from those beliefs, that would help accelerate the evolution of mankind. Now, I began to realize that this worldview and understanding of history was not accurate very early in my learning. As I mentioned to you, one of the second things I studied that I came across on the AISH website program they had called Jewish Pathways was Rabbi Ken Spiro's book, Crash Course in Jewish History. And I remember after reading that and beginning to see the reality of the distinction I remember I was at a conference. I was asked to speak at an industry event, and the MC had me stand by the stage waiting for him to call me up. I remember overhearing a conversation at a table near the stage. It was during I believe it was the presidential primary elections, and people were talking about which candidate they thought should be president. And someone would bring up, well, I support this person. And then the other person at the table would say, oh, he's had awful, unethical business dealings. And the other person would say, well, your guy has too, and would identify areas where he had unethical business dealings. And then someone would say, well, the candidate you like has had a lot of extramarital affairs. And the other person would say, well, your guy has had extramarital affairs as well, until finally someone spoke up and said, look, any great leader who's going to come into power and do any good is going to have these types of skeletons in their closet. They're going to have, business dealings that were not on the up and up. They're going to have extramarital affairs. It's just the way of men. And at that point in time, I realized, that is so sad. And that is not the way of the Jew. It has never been the way of the Jew. So in order to really analyze this and really just sort of go back in time, the more you go back in time, the more you see this great divide between the Jewish people and the other nations. And of course, I wanted to bring on the best to discuss this, the great, entertaining, brilliant historian, Rabbi Ken Spiro, to really educate us on this matter. And I do believe, my friends, that when you understand Jewish history, and you understand really that if you look at where we are today as a global population, you will begin to then understand the real source of Jewish pride and what our role has been in creation and what it continues to be.
Welcome to the Shema Podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights intertwined through personal stories as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. Now to the show.
Rabbi Ken Spiro, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me.
And I'd like to begin with a mazel tov on behalf of me and the listeners on your engagement and rapidly approaching wedding day next week. We're all very excited for you.
Thank you very much. Yes, yes. I'm actually in America getting ready, getting married in New York. Then I'm coming back to Israel, hopefully in the not too distant with my will-be wife. She's making Aliyah. I've been there 43 years, so I'm bringing her along.
Amazing.
Speed of redemption, one person at a time.
All right. So, you know the topic. I think this is very eye-opening for many because I think that's what traps a lot of Jews into the secular cultures. They're like, I'm just like everyone else. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, we're all good people working hard to provide for our families. But when you go back in time, you see something vastly different, correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, first we have to understand, we have to appreciate that, most people throughout human history are just trying to make it through the day. They're not hurting anyone. So, I mean, the whole discussion of whether people are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad, throughout history, there's good and bad people, including amongst the Jewish people. But what you mentioned, I was listening to your whole introduction there. The actual topic, what you should have read before you read Crash Course, or you should read after, I wrote a book called WorldPerfect. It's the first book I wrote, WorldPerfect, The Jewish Impact on Civilization. It was actually my master's thesis originally that I then rewrote as a book. And it deals specifically with this topic of the impact of Judaism, or we call it more generally monotheism, the Jewish impact on civilization and a bunch of different areas, but primarily in the area of morality as an outgrowth of the concept of one God, one absolute standard of morality. And you point out very interestingly enough, at the beginning, we have a kind of a incorrect notion about the ancient world. First of all, we think that there's some sort of connection between a society's development in terms of their technology, their culture, their governmental system, and their moral behavior. The reality is there's no connection at all. The notion that somehow primitive, so-called people use the word primitive, would be somehow less moral or less well-behaved. The reality is no matter what we look, there's a great book by a Harvard professor called Constant Battles, showing how whether it's the greatest civilizations that fought massive battles with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, or tribal warfare where 40 people fought in a war, but 4 were killed. That's a huge casualty figure, by the way. 4 killed, 6 injured. They're talking about like 20% or 50% of the people, or 20% killed or wounded. It's just the numbers. We see the same everywhere. So we shouldn't think that, and it's a common misconception that our modern Western liberal democratic worldview is an outgrowth of like the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. And liberal democracy has now spread far beyond the original borders of its inception, which is Europe and America, to other countries around the world. But the reality is, well, these societies, Greece and Rome, the great classical civilizations, certainly have contributed a huge amount to the world. This is not a zero-sum game. And, as a lot of people, there's a great quote, 2 things can be true at once. A society can contribute lots of good things. It can also do a lot of bad stuff at the same time. Right. So we have to distinguish between, let's say, the cultural, technological, architectural, and even legal impact at a certain level of these classical civilizations, and the morality of these civilizations. And what I did in my book, WorldPerfect, and I did this, I'm talking about, this goes back to, like mid-1990s when I started this research. I brainstormed with audiences. I used to do it like back in the day. This is, BC, before computers, or at the early years, with like a whiteboard. And I just ask the audience, like, what values would you like to see in as perfect a world as humanly possible? Like you were talking about, everyone mowed their lawn and recycled, and people were good neighbors and that kind of stuff. And I noticed, and I estimated, I asked about 1,500 people, Jews, non-Jews, religious, secular, in between, traditional, and more or less everyone kind of came up with the same list. Like it's a no-brainer. First of all, everyone came up with value of life. And without that, everything's worthless. Just slaughtering people. Equal justice doesn't matter if you're dead. And peace. We want a world of peace. We want a world of education. People are, basic fundamental literacy as a way of achieving your potential, contributing in a meaningful way to the world. The idea of equality before the law, equal justice, no institutionalized discriminatory governmental systems. And then a very broad topic, because I got so much on this, I just call it social justice. that you're proactively involved in trying to make the world a better place. And it seems to me that when you ask the average person, again, I didn't hang out so much in China and ask people that, but average Westerner, these are kind of overwhelmingly the universal values that almost seem to be innate in human consciousness. Like I always say, you buy a phone or a computer, it comes with an operating system. Like this is the basic programming that we are born with. So that's the question that you were kind of dancing around when you were doing introduction. Like, are these values innate or not? Are people basically all the same? Now you could argue like, people are basically people. We all have a soul. We all have desires. That's a universal thing. We all have drives and needs. But the impact of society on how people organize themselves and behaved amongst themselves is really quite shocking. And this was the big eye opener. Like you said, I was raised sort of believing, I had a minimal Jewish education, which I found basically irrelevant after school, Hebrew school. And I basically believed, as was taught kind of universally in Western education back when I was in school 1,000 years ago, that we are who we are because of the values of classical civilization and kind of the modern liberal democracy is a byproduct of sort of sequestering the separation of church and state, so to speak, the separation of religion from government, because religion could be very dangerous and corrupt institution, which it can be like all institutions. And therefore, when Western liberal democracy is able to take the great principles of classical civilizations, of Roman law and Greek thought, and pushed religion aside, we have this period, we went from the classical civilizations to the Dark Ages, medieval Europe, when the church was very powerful and extremely influential and was the great unifying force of Europe. And then with the Renaissance, we started to move away from that, the more humanizing, of our worldview. And then we get to the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, when science and rational thought now can trump, religion and superstition and oppression and the primitive governmental systems that were feudal or hierarchical,
Right.
like when all was finally pushed aside, we get our modern world. And the reality is that's not true on a lot of different levels. And the
Right.
reality,
Explain
yeah,
that.
and that's really what I discovered when I was writing, when I did my research on WorldPerfect. And please God, in the course of our conversation, I'll give you some really good examples of that one.
I mean, we know from Nazi Germany that they were a very cultured, well-educated society, and we know that didn't divorce them from the absolute worst cruelty ever by mankind. But sort of break this down. If we were to go back in time, going back to Mount Sinai, the Jewish people are when they first went into Israel and established themselves as a nation, and you were to compare and contrast these nations from one another. Talk about that between us and other nations, and I will share like one of the things I shared with Rabbi Spiro originally on why I wanted to do this is I came across a show on Vikings, and I quickly turned it off because I realized I need to basically increase the filter on my Netflix subscription. But their culture was rape and pillage. And it was so weird because I was watching it and you're sort of like supporting the hero, but the hero is like the worst person in the world. And that's what just gave me this idea of doing this. But yeah, do that for us if you would, just sort of compare and contrast these different nations.
Sure, sure. So first of all, you start out with a great statement about, if anything we could say about, people always ask the Holocaust, the mechanized mass murder of 6 million people. Where was God during the Holocaust? Not a topic for our discussion now. But the real question you have to ask is, if anything the Holocaust did prove was the failure of enlightened liberal democratic society to create a better world, because Germany was the most culturally, technologically, and even one of the most governmentally advanced systems in the world. And what did they use all of that for? A dictator seizes control and uses it to perpetrate, the greatest, slaughter of any people on the planet Earth on a scale we've never seen before, making what would seem to be inconceivable conceivable. You like factories for death. So for sure, that is one of the great lessons. Not that enlightened society is necessarily that way, but human beings on their own, with all their technology and culture, do not. History shows this. That's the beauty of history, Dan. There's a great line by Lord Bolingbroke, British Lord. He said, "History is philosophy teaching by example." You can hypothesize about how the human mind and reason and technology will create a better world. And it can. Technology is neutral. The human mind is neutral, can create very bad ideas there's nothing intrinsic about progress being better. Progress can give us modern medical technology and all kinds of great stuff and progress can give us Auschwitz. So you're right about that. And you're also right about what you said about the Viking show. And I know exactly that was the show Vikings. You watch that and the level of violence and the rape and the sexuality and first of all, the whole, and I'm not ragging on Viking culture, but their whole idea of heaven was basically Valhalla, where you get to fight and rape and pillage eternally and you can't die, like you get to sit in the great hall with Odin and and do it doing here. You just do it at a higher level, which is not unique to the Vikings, because you talked about these guys were the worst guys. When we look at, it's not just the Vikings. People are really into Viking shows now. It's become very like cool to talk about Vikings, and again, the Vikings are a great example. They're the first people to actually discover America before Christopher Columbus, and they definitely had certain. We get our days of the week from them, Moon Day,
Right. Yeah.
Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Freya's Day. They have not confusions.
Interesting.
You talk about like the worst guys. You see, there's a great example of what is good or bad, worse. That is us with our Western Judeo-Christian ethics projecting onto the behavior of the ancient world, which we view as something that's weird and horrible and almost incomprehensible, the levels of violence and debauchery in the ancient world. But the reality is, it's not just the Vikings, and they were far from the most sophisticated culture. When we look, if we just go through that little list and you look at the whole idea of value of life, for instance, which is so fundamental, to how we look at the world today, we see that, first of all, in the ancient world, almost every civilization practiced infanticide, the killing of newborn babies, as a way of controlling population and as a way of sex selection, meaning boys were often valued, which means newborn babies would be left by their parents on rocks to be eaten by wild animals or die of exposure. And in the ancient world, we see that human sacrifice is ubiquitous. It's universal, practiced on very different levels. But, people believed the gods needed blood. Go to the Aztec civilization of Mexico, where up to 1,000 people a week would be slaughtered. And on the pyramid of the sun, because they believed if the blood stops spilling, the world's going to cease to exist. There's a theological basis for what they're doing. It's not just wanton violence. And if you look at the ancient world, you see that blood sport, we think of the Romans with their Colosseums, and this is also very popular. We have Gladiator 1, Gladiator 2, you have, Spartacus, all these shows, which we tend to glorify, but this was the norm. And Rome was the most sophisticated civilization. They had an empire that literally ruled the Mediterranean for more than half a millennia. And yet their number one form of entertainment was watching people kill people, animals eat animals. It's like,
Right.
So this whole basic principle, value of life, is for many different reasons, including entertainment. People were just disposable on a level that was shocking. And if
Let me ask you a question.
yeah, sure.
In Greek culture, which predated Roman culture, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't remember if it was Plato or Aristotle who wrote boastfully about the advancement of their culture as he noticed the newborn infants laying in the trash bins.
Yeah.
Who was it? Was it Plato or was it Aristotle that used to pontificate about the?
I think it's Aristotle. Aristotle says a lot of things that are really, we love Aristotle. He's the he's the most influential person in Western philosophy by far. But his worldview is very much colored. But I think it's the quote of Aristotle. He says, some infants must be exposed, not because we enjoy doing this, but a limit must be fixed to the population of the state. And before you had birth control and stuff like that, that's one of the ways you did it. You just like kill babies, and it was totally normal and totally acceptable. Now, today you hear about someone, killing a baby, you think this is the sickest person on the planet Earth. We would be shocked at how different the worldview is in the ancient world. Like, that's the great example. Value of life is one of the most shocking examples. Doesn't mean everyone's running around murdering people, but the notion that you're a human, because you're a human, you have intrinsic value and a right to life, and that's going to spill over into equality before the law and other things. But you look at like the idea of peace. We have this organization called the United Nations, which arguably is a horrible failure, but I call them the useless nothings. But in theory, it's a great idea. The fact that the world kind of unites to keep peace is something we just don't see in the ancient world. We see that war, the history of humanity is constant battles. And the reasons are, first of all, it's the people are obsessed, empires and civilizations are obsessed with it's just greed is the number one, taking what's not yours by force. We see it done on a tribal level. The notion, like you see the complete rewriting of history, like, that only white people enslaved black people. Give me a break. Black people enslaved black people, then sold them to Arabs, who then sold them to white people, that kind of thing. And everyone enslaved everyone in the ancient world. The list of people who were never enslaved is fantastically small, but it all came out of conquest. I fight you, I take your land, I take your cattle, I take your women. Greed is kind of the notion you respect another country's borders, like we have today in the world. I always say, if America behaved like Rome, Canada would be independent for 15 minutes. Forget Donald Trump's statements about the 51st state. I mean, the Canadian Army, like all 10 soldiers are amazing. But come on, the US, the US the world spends about $2 trillion on weapons, and America spends almost half of that. The US spends about more than 40% of the world's defense budget is spent by the United States. So you have this idea of just taking what's not yours by force, and that was considered normal and natural. Rome never respected any country's borders. Alexander the Great went on a 10-year military campaign where he conquered everything he could get his hands on, and the only reason he stopped was because his men burnt out after 10 years of fighting. The Mongols would have taken all of Europe out to Spain had not, that Ogde, the leader of the Mongols, had died, and they had to go and have their conclave, like we elect the Pope back in Mongolia to elect the new, Khan, the new Khan kind of thing. This is totally normal in all civilizations, whether primitive tribal civilizations or vast empires. You don't have this concept of peace unless you're taking a break to rearm and fight again.
Basically, it's their only way of economic gain, of growing their nation's GDP, was you take something from someone else.
It's part of it, but also, like you talk about the Vikings, glorification. It's not just the Vikings. You notice they will sing about you in the halls of Valhalla. You always talk about Ragnar Northbrok. Whatever. These are real people, by the way. The Viking shows got it all messed up, and they fictionalized a lot of it. But the greatest honor, all the heroes of classical literature, where it's Achilles, it's Hector, it's Paris, it's Priam. These are all they're warriors. They glorify he gets the honor, the power, and the glory when he's alive, and he becomes a legend after he's dead. And you can see in all these shows, they will sing about you forever. How do you get your immortality? Right. Through who you conquer, that kind of thing. So
it wasn't just economic gain. This is how a man achieved great honor, was by his ability to go out and slaughter and kill and take what he wanted.
Yeah. Conquest was normal, not that conquer was a sign of weakness. It was considered, you could see Greeks writing about that this is war is in the mind of the poet, like the chief business of men from youth to age. It's like the thing that guys did. You have whole cultures like Sparta, which was completely militarized culture. The economy, men just fought, those who survived adulthood, and the rest of the economy was slave based. So this notion of peace and getting along, and doesn't mean that everyone was killing their neighbors. No, you had to have, we make this big mistake. We think that law and morality go together. They don't. Any culture that doesn't want anarchy, whether it's a written legal system, which is very rare in the ancient world. Most cultures had, oral things. There's rules of all the most primitive societies where people run around with no clothes in the South Pacific have very clear rules about how you can behave in terms of relationship between men and women and families and property, because if you don't, you have anarchy. But again, I have culture, therefore I have morality. No, you don't. You can be very cultured and very immoral like the Nazis. I have laws, therefore I have morality. No, you can have an extremely law and order society like ancient Rome or Nazi Germany. Germans are really into law and order, culturally, and they can be extremely brutal. This is not dealing with the fundamental issue. Same thing with education, by the way. Every Western liberal democracy and every country in the world pretty much that has any development has free public school, because it's like, I want my people to be educated. It's shocking that up until about 500 years ago, the average rate of literacy was 1 in 1,000 people could read.
And contrast that with the Jewish people.
Well, I'm just going back and showing. I'm like, you got to, before you can build up and show like what you're talking about, you got to kind of break down literacy was, first of all, a luxury because most people were on survival mode. The average person throughout human history was just trying to make it through the day. We are so spoiled. You walk into a supermarket, and if you brought a person from 1,000 years into a supermarket, they would faint. When I was a graduate student in Moscow in the 1980s, I showed pictures of American supermarkets, and these communist Russians couldn't believe it. They thought it was made up propaganda.
Yeah, I remember the story of Gorbachev coming and meeting with Reagan, and that was what sort of broke down the Soviet Union, was when he saw a grocery store. Like, how do you guys do this?
Exactly. So, but not only that, people recognize very quickly that knowledge is power, which is why in the ancient world that the keep people stupid. And this was perpetuated even by the church. So it's not something that you have virtually no one could read. Literacy was very, very rare. And then once the world becomes more literate because of the printing press and the explosion of literacy, then censorship kicks in a big way. Okay, we'll let you read, but be very careful what you can read. So it's only a very modern phenomenon that you have huge swaths of a society, 90% of the people in a society can read. Another thing is gone. And if you look at we're going through, value of life, peace, education, equal justice,
Right.
We see that societies, by the way, the more egalitarian cultures that I can see, I'm not an anthropologist, but the more tribal societies tend to be more egalitarian. It's when you get when you get the kind of agrarian societies that mass produce food, and then you can have an abundance of food and therefore and better nutrition, longer, less disease, higher birth rates, more, you get a population explosion, then
You get more trades.
you get the growth of cities and population
Yeah.
explodes. And then from once you get cities and you have fields of wheat, not everyone's necessarily farming. And this goes up and down. In medieval Europe, far more people were agrarian. Then in Rome, the city of Rome had a fantastically larger population than Rome 1,000 years ago because the whole infrastructure broke down and people had to migrate back out to the the rural living just to survive. But once you get cities, you get growth of population and stratification and specification in society. You get artisans and craftsmen and warriors and priests and soldiers and all kinds of. And then you need more complicated infrastructure. You need infrastructure for food and sanitation and water, but you also need more. That's when you get legal codes coming out of these kind of societies that are that it's all the same thing. And as a matter of fact, I
Yeah.
would say in the more sophisticated cultures, you tend to get even more stratified, more unjust situations where the vast majority of people in you go to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, most people are peasants. Many societies are slave-based, like medieval Europe. It's a feudal system where the average person really has no rights and owns nothing and is kind of the property of the nobility on whose land he's farming. But you have institutionalized inequality throughout most of history. That is the norm. And to think that Rome, because it had a great legal system, where there were then, and the ancient Babylonians had a legal system, because you can't have anarchy. But to think that that somehow by itself will create equality before the law is simply not true. You have institutionalized inequality. In the case of even feudal Europe of 1,000 years ago, you have a very teeny minority of people who all own everything and are above the law, and everyone else is at their mercy and has little or no rights. So that basic value, equality before the law, which is the foundation of Western liberal democracy, basically absent too. So boom,
Right.
boom, boom. We're just going through all these things and we're seeing. And the last one, just to touch on, we'll go and switch it over, is the idea of social responsibility, like taking care of the world. Today, government will take care of people who are down and out. You have food programs and housing, and none of that exists in the ancient world. And we have international social responsibility. You have international monetary fund and United Nations peacekeeping forces, and you have volunteer organizations and the World Bank and, Doctors Without Borders and, Human Rights Watch and all these people monitoring and helping. And I always say, can you imagine asking the Romans for a peacekeeping force? You just,
Right.
like I'm saying, today we hear about Greece and Rome. Trust me, Dan, 2,000 years ago, if you heard the Romans were coming to town or Alexander the Great was on his way, you were freaking out in panic. This was
Right.
not something. First, they'd rape and pillage, and then they'd subjugate. And then if you just played by their rules, paid their taxes, and recognized that they ruled, they'd let you live and get on with it. Which doesn't mean there wasn't sophisticated. It's not a zero-sum game here. You had great ideas and technology coming out of the ancient world. Most people are just trying to survive. But the basic moral furniture of the human mind, as the great historian Paul Johnson used to say, is not a byproduct of these civilizations. And therefore, as you started out in the beginning talking about, most of our conception of where we come and where we got it from is, I guess, not a zero-sum game. We got a lot of great stuff from these cultures, but the basic, our moral, ethical, spiritual framework does not come from the Greeks, the Romans, the ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, none of that stuff. That's where we, the teeny tiny Jewish people, come in and have our own little empire or our own giant
So,
empire.
so let me ask you this. so the common person throughout history who just wanted to, provide for his family, didn't really want to, wasn't aggressively trying to harm anyone. Was there a level of dependency on their morality based off the economic conditions? Meaning, if economic conditions became scarce, did their ideas of right and wrong change? Because I see, I was talking in the economics class I teach. We're going over government debt, implicit cost, and when you add them all up, the government debt 36 trillion plus the implicit liabilities of Medicare and Social Security, it's like 120 trillion dollars. And they're like, well, what happens if they can't? The U.S. government can't fix that? Because and I was like, well, that's when we go to Israel, because when there's economic decline, a lot of people's definition of what's right and wrong starts to change a little bit, and usually the Jews get targeted in those situations. But to me, that's something too throughout history. When there's prosperity, people are much better to one another. But when there's people who are lacking things, those ideas change.
For sure. You're 100% right. You see it throughout history, with the breakdown of the Roman Empire in the West in 475 CE. Obviously what different things will evolve out of that, the feudal system and the church. But there's no question you're going to a deeper question, which is what decides the morality. And it's not based on an absolute standard. It can be very pragmatic. For instance, in the feudal system of Europe, which is an outgrowth of the collapse of the Roman Empire, something's got to replace it. The major players, the haves, not the have-nots, which are the vast majority of the population, be it the nobility or the church, which is a major player in the feudal system, will basically take, even the Bible itself, or quotes from like the Christian Bible and Paul, and use it to justify the system of stay in your place, for instance. It's a very big idea, like Paul, the apostle, the greatest innovator, spreader of Christianity in its early years in the first century. It's like, don't rebel against authority. Now, come on, if you're a major player in the church and you have huge feudal land holdings and you're kind of in bed with the nobility in this relationship, well, I'll support you and justify you and spiritually back you, and you'll like protect me. And, we both have a vested interest in keeping the average person under our thumb. But it goes back to the basic point that when morality is not based on an absolute system, changing circumstances will cause it to evolve. And you talk about, if people listening want to understand this, just watch the plethora of dystopian TV series they have on plague hits, zombie apocalypse, society breaks down. You have little clans of people living in a little town. They build a fence or a wall and they're fighting off other people and killing each other. And within that community, there's got to be some sort of sense of community because it's necessitated for survival. You need a certain level of cooperation, to produce food and to protect yourself. But it's us against those guys kind of stuff. And this is the universe that's kind of based on, those shows are based on how human nature will work. Because when push comes to shove, what we tend to go back to are our basic needs. And that's why all of these societies, because they're not, it's like, the question is, Dan, like, okay, so what were their value systems based on? And it's based on, first of all, what we need, like the basic, satisfying the basic need for survival and cooperation, but also what's most expedient. For instance, overpopulation. Back then it was a big thing. Feed your population could be very challenging. So you got to get rid. This is before the birth control pill and anything like that. And so the easiest people to get rid of are babies. Let's kill babies. That kind of stuff. We need more stuff because we're running short. So we'll invade. That's what Hitler was all about. Lebensraum, we need to like spread out and make a greater Germany to have more land, more resources for us. That's the Nazis were into that, but that's a very ancient idea. We'll just take your stuff. So this is how we see the world working. And you're right. You're talking about what happens if someone talking about a book where they say that someone air blasts 3 nuclear weapons over the U.S. You have EMT, electronic, EMP, electronic, the pulse that wipes out the entire electrical grid. Think about what happened in a place like America. We are so dependent on us, everything collapses. No electricity, no water, no food, no communication. Your bank account, which is totally digital, disappears. You have nothing. And suddenly you get your gun out of your house, you start boarding up the windows and hoarding all your canned goods, like in your back too, It's scary thought, but that's the more things change, the more they stay the same. That's what drives human nature. And that's where Judaism comes in, which is so incredibly revolutionary. Because, first of all, when you look at those values that we went through, and we showed how they're basically lacking in the ancient world, and then we look at what Judaism says about those values, we see that our kind of Western worldview is in line with the Jewish worldview because it seeped into the collective consciousness of not just the Western world, but most of the world, directly and often indirectly through Judaism and the impact of Judaism, let's say on the creation of Christianity, which is a direct offshoot, which incorporates in the Christian Bible, is literally like lifted. It's a continuation of the Hebrew Bible, and nothing that is said pretty much in the New Testament, so to speak, is not just a rephrasing of what was said earlier by the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. And you can see that the whole notion of Judaism brings in this idea, like the Ten Commandments, which are all in the Supreme Court doors, the chambers of the Supreme Court
Right.
have the tablets on them. You know, don't murder. It's not don't kill, by the way. Judaism is not pacifist. Sometimes you got to kill evil. Sometimes you got to go to war to protect yourself. But not that human life has intrinsic value is a Jewish concept that you can't kill. You can't kill babies. You don't kill people for entertainment. God doesn't need human blood. Wow, that is incredibly innovative. That's huge. That peace is an abstract ideal that is fundamental to Judaism. It's how you say hello in Hebrew is the word shalom, which means peace. That the ideal state for mankind is what's outside the United Nations in Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, which is the quote from Isaiah about they'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. If you read that to the Romans 2,000 years ago, they would have needed Prozac. That's how depressed they would have been. Because their idea of peace is we conquer and suppress everyone, and then we got peace.
Right,
that
right.
that equal justice that that all human beings are created in the image of God, and there's a fundamental equality that you have to pursue justice. I mean, it is so the Jewish laws, we just read them in the weekly Torah readings about the importance of how you treat your fellow human being, and that not taking bribes, and and the importance of justice, and setting up a legal system that is based on absolute principles that must be meted out equally to everyone, that no one is above the law, that a king of Israel had to walk around with a mini Torah scroll attached to his arm because it says in the book of Deuteronomy, so he will learn to fear the Lord his God and keep all the words of his Torah and do its statutes. That the king has to know as a king of kings. No, you don't use God to justify your oppression by misreading his book. You recognize that God gave us basic rights. We're all made in his image and we have to treat each other equally. There's a system of laws that's immutable. Education, that you have to be educated. And Jews, by the way, the Jewish people are unique in being history's only continuously literate society. Not 100% literacy, but the Jewish rates of literacy in small persecuted Jewish communities in Europe were far higher than the people amongst whom they lived, which is why Jews were so valued throughout ancient history. People hated us, but they still needed us because we could read and write and we knew math, that kind of stuff. This is because it goes back to the notion that you have to be educated because, as it's the famous statement of the rabbis, that an ignorant person can't be righteous. Ignorance is the most dangerous thing in the world. That's why totalitarian regimes like to keep you that way, because they can control you.
Right.
And the notion, most importantly, that you have to be proactively involved in taking care of the world. Don't stand by your neighbor's blood. These are quotes from Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. The first environmental law, by the way, the first animal rights legislation that appears in the world, it all appears in the Hebrew Bible. The notion you have to give 10% of your income to charity, whether you like it or not, that you can't stand by your neighbor's blood. If you see a human being, it's interesting, Dan, that, every civilization has legal codes, but legal codes are designed to keep law and order. Don't murder, don't steal, don't stop at the red light, pay your taxes, you're a good citizen. Judaism says, yeah, but you have to proactively do good. And if you look at there's almost no legal system in the world. It's been 3,339 years since Mount Sinai. And there is virtually no legal code on the planet Earth that demands you actively do good outside the Bible.
Right. There's Bava Metzia, even if you see, like on the area of lost objects, if you see someone's property, you see their animal, we can't even ignore that. You have to go and take care of it. That, I'm sure, was absolutely unheard of. You would probably take it for yourself, much less care for it and do all the things necessary in order to return the lost object to the rightful owner.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, you had certain levels. You had to have things about property ownership and damages because otherwise you'll have anarchy in a society. So you do find legal codes in the ancient world that do talk about these things, and some of them are. We don't have Jewish people do not have, like a monopoly on common sense. Like there's certain ideas that are pretty straightforward, which is why, by the way, although sexuality is completely out of control in the ancient world, like. There's no idea of gender specific correct or incorrect sexual behavior in the ancient world. I mean, men are pansexual in antiquity. They slept with anything and everything with slight variations. But it's interesting that almost every culture has something about incest. Like sleeping with your sister is just not healthy. That's kind of like stealing from your neighbor just ain't going to work because you're going to steal from him before long. It's going to be murder and rape and everything's going to fall apart. So there's a certain level of practicality, but what brings us out of that level of just keeping enough law and order so that things don't fall apart versus creating a world where people care and are good neighbors and take care of the world and try and make it a better place and are altruistic in their thinking is overwhelmingly a byproduct of the Jewish people. Can I read you? It's an interesting quote. I just want to read you. This is
Yes.
a quote from Paul Johnson. It's such a great quote. He passed away like a year and a half ago, but this is in his book, A History of the Jews. He says, one way of summing up 4,000 years of Jewish history is to ask ourselves, what would have happened to the human race if Abraham had not been a man of great sagacity? That means to be sage like, wise or clever. Or if he had stayed in Ur, Iraq, where he'd and kept his higher notions to himself and no specific Jewish people would have come into being. He says, certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. Humanity might eventually have stumbled upon all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. Now I have to answer. He's saying the Jews formulated this. What Judaism would say is no, the creator of the universe gave us these ideas. They're absolute. They come from outside of that's a separate thing. But he goes on to say, to them, meaning to the Jewish people, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. Above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result was monotheism and the three great religions which profess it. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. That's wow. Whoa. And that's a fantastic quote. And if you look at he says basically all the things I touched on, he says that came from the Jewish people, which doesn't mean that Jews are perfect and non-Jews are horrible. No, there are rotten Jews in this world and there are righteous Gentiles. That's not the issue. But this basic moral furniture comes overwhelmingly from the Jews. And what it comes from, because the most important Jewish contribution to the world is not value of life, peace, social justice, education, and proactive social responsibility. It's ethical monotheism, the notion of one God and one absolute standard of morality, that what is right and wrong, good and evil is not a popularity contest. God doesn't care what you think is correct behavior. He gives you the rules and you have to meet it out. You don't stand by and let him punish and reward. That's humanity's job, to take responsibility for the world that he put us in and created for us. But the system is immutable. It can be adapted as technology and the moral and systems change. It's a flexible system, which is based on principles that can be adapted to deal with changing circumstances of technology and as culture evolves. How do you deal with artificial insemination and AI and things like that? And morality halacha, which is the word for Jewish law, deals with that. But these are absolute principles that you cannot mess with. And this is the greatest transformative idea the Jews brought into the world. And the other thing that I think the listeners need to understand is Judaism is not a religion. It is in the classical way. It's not just about how we relate to this spiritual entity, which is what we think of religion. No, Judaism is a holistic worldview. It deals with has rules. There's these 613 commandments and a myriad of rabbinic law that deal with our relationship with the spiritual side of things, like keeping kosher and keeping the Sabbath and our relationship with God and yada, yada, yada. But every single thing that you can come across, whether it's property ownership, damages, war and peace, marriage and divorce, anything is in the purview of halacha. It is a completely holistic system that was designed by the perfect being to enable us on an individual level to run our own lives and direct our drives and our passions into the right way. And it's very practical. It doesn't demand perfection. The halacha legislates for all the things that can go wrong with the fallibility of human behavior, but it sets a very high bar to try and be as godlike as humanly possible, but not just on a personal level, on a societal level. So nothing is outside the purview. And this is the really monumentally transformative force the Jewish people have had, where we have had no physical empire. The only Jewish empire in history has been Hollywood, and it hasn't been a source of Jewish values. We Jews created Hollywood. The Jewish empire is it's the power of ideas to transform the world, not the power of power to transform the world. Because all the powerful powers that ruled the world, the Greeks and the Romans, and everyone else, as Mark Twain says, they sit in twilight now or vanished. The Jewish people, we lost our country, went into exile, were persecuted more than anyone else for longer and more irrationally and violently than anyone else in the world. Yet arguably, we have had the most transformative impact on the world. But because it's come so indirectly, people often fail to see that it has come from the Jewish people. But
Right.
really, the greatest triumph, we outlasted these people physically. The Greeks and the Roman Empire, they're gone. And the ancient Egyptian Empire is gone. And the Persians and the Babylonians, and they're gone. Well, the Persians are still around, but
Let me ask you this, Rabbi.
yeah,
A lot of societies strive for ethics detached from monotheism, detached from an infinite eternal creator. The way I see it, that always breaks down because when you know that all your sustenance and everything is coming from an infinite eternal creator, then you don't have a scarce mindset, which I think would drive a lot of behavior in cultures. They lack something, so that's why they resort to taking it, versus a society built around the idea that this is all a manifestation of the creator's will, and we serve his will. We don't, he's the one that provides for all our needs. And you look at Russia right now, their desire to go and hit Ukraine, that was, you still see these things playing out in society today.
100%. 100%. By the way, you're bringing up, Dan, a really interesting idea, which was brought up by an American Jewish sociologist in the mid 20th century named Will Herberg. He wrote a book that was so powerful, and he came up with an idea which is so transformative. It's called the cut flower ethics. And he uses the analogy of cut flowers. It's brilliant. He says, cut flowers, you cut off flowers, you put them in a vase, and they look nice for a week, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. But after that, they wither and die. He said, so too with those values of Western liberal democracy that have so transformed the world. And Western liberal democracy is the greatest political, it's like Churchill said about democracy. He said it's the worst form of government, except for every other system that's been tried from time to time throughout history. For all of its failings and faults, it's created more equality, more opportunity, more prosperity, lifted more people out of poverty than any other system. But its values come from the Judeo-Christian ethics, or really the Judeo ethics. But when you cut them off from their spiritual God-based roots and just say, then they wither and die. They metastasize is a better, which is why you have what's called liberal. John Locke would vomit. He's the founder of the concept of liberal democracy and what's being called liberalism today, which is really progressive. Right. That is, everything moving forward is always good is not a Jewish concept. And progressive political ideologies created fascism and Nazism, by the way. Those were the most popular progressive political ideologies of 100 years ago. But you're 100% right about that point, that you cannot separate their God-based absolute moral source, their roots, from the upper part. That's what you see happening. And what's interesting in, this misconception that it's the West weaning itself off of the church and the Age of Enlightenment, separation of church and state, created the modern world, is completely incorrect. There's a great book by Eric Nelson that came out, I think, in 2010 called The Hebrew Republic, which caused a revolution in how we look at the world. And to sum up his book in like a minute or two, but it's a fascinating read, a must-read book. He said it's basically believed that the Great Separation, which is the separation of church and state, allowed the emergence of the basic framework of modern Western liberal democracy. He said it's not true. He said with the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, which was a summons to go back to the Bible instead of ignoring it and go see what God has to say, along with the early modern thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries, talking about the 1600s and 1700s, people like John Locke, Tom Hobbes, Hugo Grotius, the father of international law. These people were all Hebraists. They're basically looking at how can we move Europe and civilization away from this feudal system of hierarchy, make it a better world. Well, if God is a perfect being, you can't do better than perfection. Let's go back to the Bible and let's look at what God's preferences for government are. And they approach the Bible not so much as a theological work of religion, but as a work of a governmental blueprint. And unlike the modern evangelical fundamentalists who are literal scripturalists who only read the text of the Bible, these guys understood that Jewish law is not learned from the written law, it's learned from the oral law. The Mishnah, the Talmud, the classical thinkers like the Rambam, one of the great medieval scholars, who codified all of this, they actually went into the oral law. Either they learned Hebrew or had these works translated, and they started dealing with what does God say about kingship? What does he say about government? What does he say about separation of powers? And it's that system, by the way, that America is really founded on this one. But it's that system. The US government is actually based on the biblical model. Chief political leader is the president. They offered George Washington to be king. He said, you just got rid of King George. You don't need another King George. Let's replace him with a president. But a judicial legislative body, which is based on the Sanhedrin. You have separation of church and state does not know God and religion. America is the most God-based state ever founded in human history. Having God we trust on the money, but it's that the king is not the high priest. In Judaism, they had the Kohen Gadol. So we see that it's precisely going into the Bible as literally as a political text, as a governmental model, creates what is the first democratic republic of the United States, which is the most transformative governmental force in modern human history. And that's a big eye opener. Like, whoa, that totally changes that where we thought it came from. It's because precisely God was in the workings and God's system was in the workings that it was able to be adopted and transformed to be absorbed by other great civilizations. But what has happened is in more modern, as Will Herbert saw in 1952 when he wrote this book, that process of distancing government from God is metastasized into a world that is absolutely wacky. With nothing, you can't know anything's right or wrong. You can't define what a man is or a woman is. Everything's about how you feel. Judaism can give a crap about how you, I'm sorry, my French, about how you feel about something. It's not insensitive to people's feelings. You can't insult people. You can't embarrass people. That's very much in Jewish law. But how you feel is not how you run a society. There's principles, there's objective reality. That is the essence of what Judaism is about. Objective reality and the values that are objectively true. But because Western society has what started out, especially Europe, which was they just elected a new pope. Europe was the foundational culture of Christianity, which transformed the world and eventually brought these ideas into the world. Europe isn't religious anymore. The further north you go, I think you get to Sweden, it's like 12% of Swedes believe in God. Like who's religious? You go to Africa, go to South America. And America is still a pretty religious state. But that is the real danger. And we go back to where we started from in the beginning of what you were talking about. When we think that these values and ideas and laws are just come from like this kind of logic and rational thinking that is divorced itself from its relationship with its source, we make a very fatal mistake for society. And that's where the world unfortunately has been heading. And that's how the world's dividing up, basically. It's not dividing, it's dividing between those people, be they Jews who are connected to Jewish tradition. And I'm not saying good and bad here again, and basically a lot of the evangelical Christian community, which takes the Bible very seriously, and the world that believes there's one God, one absolute standard of morality, and there's good and evil and right and wrong in an absolute sense. And those people who don't, that is the way the world is really dividing up. That's the progressive left and the conservative right. That's the fundamental issue that's going to decide where the world goes.
The more you see this attempt to bifurcate these two areas, especially like in these European countries, the more you see the decay of their societies.
Yeah. But not only that, you can see Europe, for instance, is losing out in a big way, A, because they've cut them off from their own Judeo-Christian ethics, and B, because they're letting into their country, they become super universalistic. Like not only do we not value our own culture and our origins and our faith, we actually hate ourselves for being the oppressors. We bought the lie that we're the oppressors. I mean, European civilization did some horrible stuff. Colonial Europe was not a nice thing, but this is not unique. This is all of human history and all of human civilization. It was the Mongols and the Chinese and the Japanese. They all did it just as much. And the Zulu, everyone did this, but we don't value who we are and we feel guilty about it. You know, a nation that doesn't value its past has no right to dream about its future. And we're letting in millions of the most particularist people who are Muslims, who are religious. And not all Muslims are horrible and evil. I'm not saying that, but these are people who believe very much in a God-based worldview, which is their God-based worldview. And they openly say that we're just going to outbreed you and take you over because you've given up and we have not. And we have a worldview which demands, and this is a whole discussion on Islamic worldview, which is not radical Islam, but mainstream Islam, has a very deterministic worldview. There's a God who runs the world, and the whole world, and Muhammad's the final prophet, and the world's going to be divided between the world of Islam and the world of war. And Europe is the world of war, Dar al-Harb. And it's just a matter of time where either we will either demographically outbreed you, or just take you over another way. Like so that's a
So,
dangerous combination. That very
right.
particularistic people who believe in their way of life and are very into who they are and what their vision is, versus people who don't believe in the way of life except being comfortable. Decadence is the killer of empires. Way before the foreign force comes and overruns way before the Vandals and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths overran the Roman Empire, Rome had already committed suicide with no birth rates. Nothing changes, not having any kids, not
Right.
believing in our values, losing sight of what we're about and what we want to accomplish. Bad stuff.
Right. So you have either a lot of society either not wanting anything to do with an idea of a God, or the group that does, their version of God is Allah, that you must kill everyone who doesn't follow your way of life. So I think you paint a very good picture of the influence. I had no idea it was that direct or that acknowledged. I thought it was maybe other societies sort of saw the way Israel conduct itself. I didn't realize they were actually looking into our old Torah, to our Talmud, and that actually became the blueprint for a lot of, basically, for Western society.
Yeah, yeah, but you have to talk to priests. It's not That's in the modern political development, but really the big change, and this is a topic I speak on a lot. People don't realize the Catholic Church, the Bible was not translated into the vernacular local languages. Even if it was, by the way, this is a mere the last 500 years. Read about people like Tyndale and Wycliffe and people who were actually killed for translating the Bible. The Bible was remember, the Christian Bible contains the Jewish Bible. It was the Vulgate. The Vulgate is the Latin translation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, basically. First of all, no one had books. No one could read books. But the number one book on the Catholic Church's list of index of books you weren't allowed to have access to was the Bible. And people would say, What? What do you mean? The Bible is the foundation of Christianity. They would selectively read quotes in Latin out of it that no one understood they were talking about. So the influence of the Bible as the foundational transformative force does not kick off until you get to the Protestant Reformation, which happens to correspond a century earlier with the creation of the printing press. So with the availability of books that could be printed cheaply, and the first book printed is the Bible in Western civilization, Gutenberg. The Bible, by the way, sells up, I think, 4,000 to 6,000 copies an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So once the Bible in the last few hundred years starts to get out there and people can start reading it and the rates of literacy go up, even before it's concurrent with the governmental thing. They're not separate, but with the people like Hobbes and Locke and Grotius and Selden and all these philosophers, combined with people just looking at the Bible as a moral tenet. Like, what does the Bible say? Okay, love your neighbor as yourself, be righteous. Even if they didn't lack the understanding that Judaism has, that no statement in the Bible goes without the specific explanation. When it says love your neighbor as yourself, there's massive rabbinic discussion on what that means practically. It doesn't mean just hug everyone, walk around with a smiley button and wave to people. I
Right.
mean, so,
Yeah.
but it's starting to just absorb the notion that there's a God and there's reward and punishment, good and evil, and right and wrong in an absolute sense. Combine that with the governmental impact as we talked about, of the Hebrew Republic, so to speak, that creates the best possible system that the world can adapt. It's not just, it's the moral values, people walking around with an idea that there is a right and wrong, there is a good and evil, and there's reward and punishment, and I'm going to pay the consequences of the misbehavior. Even if Judaism says you're not supposed to behave based on reward and punishment, but that's the lowest level, but at least that keeps things stable and keeps people behaving properly. You're supposed to be
Right.
righteous because God is righteous. But all this put together is one of the great misunderstood stories of human history, and the real empire of the Jewish people is not the physical one, but the transformative impact of our ideas, often indirectly brought to the world by whether it's modern liberal democracy or Christianity onto human consciousness.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Anything else you want to add to this subject?
I mean, no, except that, first of all, I highly recommend reading WorldPerfect, the book, because I really go into it in detail. You don't really appreciate that,
I'll put
but
that in the show notes.
absolutely. But that this is the thing that we Jews have to appreciate. And for people listening, people, oh, that's great, it's beautiful. But the one thing to close on is, in a world that has moved away from God and is so confused about such basic, obvious, even biological truths, it has always been the Jewish people's job not to convert, not to conquer, but to be humanity's role model. And how do we do that? It's by living and acting in a way that inspires other people. I always have the quote I love is, we all know the quote, imitation is the highest form of flattery. It's like people copy you. They maybe even don't like you. They're copying you. It means that they respect what you're doing. They know it's the right thing to do. I say imitation is the highest form of flattery. I say this is the shortest class you ever got on liberal democracy and Christianity. If it wasn't for us doing it right, often in the worst, most difficult circumstances, exiled and persecuted, the world would not be here today. But for those of us today who see how we've transformed the world and see how much the world is a rudderless ship that needs direction, we have to recognize that you can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represents. That we have to. The world is not going to leave the Jewish people in the Jewish state alone until we finish the job that Abraham started thousands of years ago of being that role model for humanity. But you have to be educated as a Jew to do that. You can't just feel. I think that Judaism is about social justice. Social justice is something Judaism brought into the world, but Judaism is not just social justice. It's a holistic system. And my big call is that people have to have some Jewish pride, and people have to be educated. Jews have to invest in understanding the beauty. God doesn't need us to do anything for him. He gave us a system that enables us to fulfill our potential, be happy as individuals and collectively, and create a world that is the best run world humanly possible. And that's the Jewish people's one and only responsibility, to learn that system, live by that system individually and collectively, and lead by example. And when we start to do that, the world will line up behind us and stop fighting against us, but support us. And that's really what our mission is in the world. That's the great calling of the Jewish people. That's the great vision of the prophet Isaiah.
Can't think of a better way to close out that conversation than with those words, Rabbi Spiro. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dan, for having me.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast. To share feedback, suggest future topics, or ask questions for the host or his guests, you can email him at shamapodcastshow@gmail.com. That is shamapodcastshow@gmail.com, or click the show notes to join the growing WhatsApp community.